Hello. As you can see, this is a different approach. Hopefully this will work out well because the slides and the concepts here and examples especially work far more with pictures and images rather than things that I can draw on the board pretty readily. The other difference between this and the others is in a normal class situation, what I would do is have a brief introduction of these and follow that up with a discussion for most of a class period. Whereas in this situation, having a discussion like that is obviously not as directly possible. So I will speak at a bit greater length about the issues in this. And I'll post this and there will be discussion points on the exam. So we're looking at moving from the different techniques and how to choose between them to how they are working with and interplaying with society. So I have applications to society here, and in a way, there are four different aspects of the statistical process that society can affect. The first of those is the data, that what data is available, what data is not available, is it accurate, can you trust it? The next is the question. What questions get asked are in many cases a function of the society at the time and the place when and where they are being asked. After all, before a few months ago, absolutely nobody would have thought to inquire that much about the effects of a coronavirus pandemic. The third approach here is the technique. So the choice of techniques is, in a sense, the most indirect way that society affects, because most of the time society really doesn't care whether you use an ANOVA versus a regression. But what technologies and techniques are available, have been developed. Some of the more recent techniques we have looked at in this course are the spatial lag and spatial error regression, as well as the local indicators of spatial autocorrelation. So if you go back and you look at work people did in the 60s or 70s, you cannot fault them for not using these techniques because the techniques themselves did not yet exist. Lastly, it can come in, society can affect what we do through the presentation. That what is an effective presentation depends upon the reader of that presentation or the viewer, and thereby, of course, society affects what may or may not be deemed an effective or useful presentation. So as I said, just repeating this in the slide form, questions to consider: what data is available? What type of data is it? So is it structured as a series of books? Is it a series of maps? Is it a computer table? How are you getting the data? Whether or not spatial, nominal, ordinal, interval ratio, and what do you want to know? That's where the questions come in. What are you asking of the data? Do you want, say, a before and after comparison? Looking for spatial autocorrelation. Just a couple examples there. And who is the audience of those results? A lot of the labs that we have had have been in the vein of writing for a director or somebody who would be using the information to make a decision. That, however, is not the only possible audience, as we will see later in this video. You consider what they need to know. Most of the time, a decision maker type audience does not need to know the individual tools and software that you used. They just want to know, what are the results? What do I learn from it, and how do I use this? A scientific audience would be different, and a public audience would, again, be something different from the decision makers. And just as important, as we have seen in the lab reports, it's not just what they need to know, but also what do they not need to know, and removing the information, not telling the information that is not really important or relevant for the purposes of what you're trying to convey. So I have a few broader societal, philosophical, ethical type questions. The first one is access to personal data. I have 3 examples here. The first one in the top left here, a Target story where the company Target, of course, they keep track through the loyalty cards. Kroger's does the same, any other grocery store. They keep track of what you do and don't purchase. Most of the time, this is used for, and far as you can tell, is used to do things like decide what coupons to send to you. And in some cases, most of the time, that's harmless. In some cases, however, Target was able to identify what a person was searching for and trying to get, and started sending information and ads for things like diapers and strollers. Unfortunately, she had not yet told her father that she was pregnant. So who should access this data? Should Target or other stores be able and allowed to use that data? Under what conditions? Oftentimes, they will sell this data on to other groups, to other people. And basically, they are making a profit off of their customers through the data, not just through selling stuff to the customers. One thing I have seen is that, or a statement I've seen in terms of especially apps on smartphones, if you are not paying for it, then you are not the customer, you are the product, because they have to make their money somehow. If it's not from you, they're using you to make their money for others. So there are arguments that companies, maybe they shouldn't have access. Maybe they should have to remove or destroy their records. Maybe they should not be allowed to share or sell the data, even if they're allowed to keep it internally. So there are those questions, and indeed, in many cases, the US versus European countries will have differing viewpoints on things like this. Also, and in some ways also a contrast between the US and other countries, we see on the other half of the image here, a cover from Wired magazine of a fellow named Edward Snowden. He was a contractor working for US intelligence agencies, and he revealed the existence of very large programs within the government, especially the National Security Administration, NSA, that amounted to collecting huge amounts of data spying on Americans. They are undoubtedly allowed to collect data on foreign, on non-Americans, whether those people are inside or outside US territory. The main thing for what Snowden was finding is that if programs that were officially set up to collect information on people who were not American, at the same time collected information on those who are American citizens, they kept it. They used that data, in effect, to spy on Americans. Is this a valid program for national security, or is it an unconstitutional intrusion into the privacy of US citizens? Snowden clearly felt it was the latter, and as a whistleblower announced or revealed the existence of these to some journalists. He had to leave the country. He took a somewhat roundabout way, but he is currently and still residing in Russia, knowing he would face prosecution should he return to the US. So again, it's not just corporate access to personal data, but government access to personal data. Should they have that? What should be done with it? Another angle of the personal data approach, there's nothing in the directly in the slide here, but there are laws protecting personal data as it relates to education, especially at college, and as it relates to health records, where I would have to go through large amounts of training to access individual health records, and I would not be allowed to do anything that reveals any kind of personal information. The same, except for the training part, I am not allowed to reveal personal information for grades, including to parents and other family members, with the very rare exception of a student who happens to be under the age of 18, or a student who has explicitly given that permission. So there are laws protecting at least some classes of personal information, even if it's not protecting every single amount or class of personal information. For that data which is collected, what data should be publicly available? And in a way, the publicly available relates to the Strava story here, where they, with the user's permission, they collected the data of people's running routes. And one day they just went and uploaded and released all of the routes that their system had tracked as a heat map to show more common routes, less common routes. And in so doing, recognizing that they didn't recognize, I guess, many of their users were soldiers stationed in Afghanistan at the time and elsewhere in the world, revealing inadvertently the layouts of military bases, or even the existence of military bases that had not been acknowledged throughout parts of Afghanistan, potentially Iraq, and elsewhere. So that's definitely an unfortunate release of data. Then there's also what should be free. Many of you, especially if you have taken remote sensing, have used Landsat data. Landsat data is, at least currently, freely available. This is not guaranteed, as the Landsat Advisory Group in the past couple years has started a study to look at ways to charge the users to recover the cost of producing the data. This is, as I kind of alluded to again, a case of the US government and some of the other governments having differing viewpoints, where the US government, if data is collected with taxpayer money, then except for cases of national security, that data must be made available. And the government cannot make a profit on that data. That said, the government can charge for data. Most of the time they currently do not, because the cost of dissemination of the data, when it's as simple as downloading, is usually negligible. For example, you can go and you can download census data at the aggregate level. So again, there's no private information from the census that is released, except for the census is more than 75 years old. So the individual data is eventually released, but long after most of the respondents have passed away. The data, the census data used to be released in the form of atlases. The government can charge for the cost it took to produce the atlas. They could not charge anything above and beyond that and make a profit, but they could charge for the atlas. When it's just downloading the data, the cost of production is greatly diminished, so the census does not charge. That said, Landsat is looking into ways to charge and recoup those costs. Especially in some European countries, that data that is collected by the government might simply not be released at all. A third way in which science, statistics, and politics can interact is through politics. Yes, through how society interacts is through politics. There are a few recent examples. The March for Science that started on Earth Day 2017, that have been up through 2019 repeated marches for science. Obviously, there was not a March for Science 2020 because of the pandemic that is going on. There's the story there here on the right, scientists racing to save climate data from the Trump administration, where people had noticed that some of the websites that used to host climate records from the National Weather Service and other agencies started to disappear off of the internet. Those sites were just simply taken down. And therefore, as soon as this was observed, people went to download and distribute as much data as possible that had been on the internet through the government websites so that this data was not lost. Last is the US Census citizenship question that was floated. It was struck down. This question does not exist on the census. There were questions like this many, many decades ago, or a century or more ago, but there has not for a long time. The Trump administration wanted to add it to the 2020 census, and this was, as I said, struck down or removed from the census. So there could be arguments of it may be important to recognize the citizenship status, although as I look at this, there would be very much a question of if you are a citizen, why does it matter if you were born in Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, Northern Marianas versus what we think of as the main 50 states and the District of Columbia. Or there are people who argue that this is something that would be used to basically identify where illegal immigrants may live, even though it does not ask for legal status. There are fears and were fears that this could be used for that, and ultimately those fears in many cases are why it was not included on the census for this year. That, and basically the Trump administration tried to add it too late for it to be easily collectible. Another example of how society interacts with statistics and data is what I have here, the age of alternative facts, where one of the Trump spokespeople, Kellyanne Conway, in reference to the pictures on the left, these, and I'll get to them shortly, basically said Trump was not lying, he was giving alternative facts, which then became a buzz phrase for a while. So the first one, within a couple of days, the inauguration, people in the year 2017, people noticed that a comparison of the Trump inauguration in 2016 versus Obama's first term inauguration in 2008, that the crowds were much, much smaller for Trump. Trump then wanted the National Park Service, who took these pictures, wanted them to take these pictures down or to alter them or to somehow explain that no, in fact, Trump had more people at his inauguration than Obama did at his first. What this is doing is saying, if you look closely, please look at the following two photos, A or B. Which photo has more people? The first, it doesn't say which photo is which inauguration. This is the percent giving the wrong answer. Those who voted for Trump, 40% of them simply said this photo B is the one that was from Trump's inauguration. Only a much smaller percentage of Clinton voters made the same error, and non-voters were in between. Also, with asking which photo has more people, A or B. 15%, or about 1 in 6 Trump voters, recognized apparently that this was the photo of the Trump inauguration, and nonetheless said this photo A has more people in it. And the numbers are much lower there for Clinton voters and non-voters. So when Trump went and said, this photo has more people, his inauguration had more people, the number of people who will believe that can be a fairly substantial amount. Fast forward a few more years, and we now have where he talked about the possibility of injecting oneself with disinfectants to treat coronavirus. And people started, a few people, not widespread, a few people started drinking Clorox because, again, the president suggested this. That does not mean that it is a trustworthy thing to do. And this example being about Trump giving false information, Trump lying, and that the alternative facts were a reference to Trump does not mean that this is unique to the Republican Party or unique to the right wing. A concept or a belief that is both mistaken and more widespread among more liberal individuals. A medical journal, The Lancet. So this is, the Lancet is a journal that is basically in the medical world equivalent to Science or to Nature. A very high profile journal that people would typically believe. And they published a paper claiming a link between autism and a vaccine. They since retracted that, and there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of follow-up studies debunking this link, proving that this paper, even though it was in a high-profile medical journal, ended up being incorrect and later disproven. Even so, quite a large number of people will believe the one disproven article instead of the hundreds of articles and studies that contradicted it that came afterwards. So an important thing here would be looking at information literacy, to look at the source of the information, whether it is trustworthy, and even though the Lancet is and was a trustworthy source of information, I would nonetheless say, in that case, look at, has there been follow-up information that discredits it or provides new information that says, you know, maybe we should change our beliefs here. Yet another way that society, in this case, a certain amount academic society, can affect statistics is statisticians discussing and claiming that basically we need to change the paradigm within which statistics is taught and conducted. And this, I recognize, is something that might undercut to a certain extent everything that was said throughout the course. Not everything, I should hope, but to recognize that even though we are using p-values, at the outset, I was clear that p-values, the threshold we use of 0.05 is arbitrary, and it should not be as itself a simple blind decision-making threshold. But that is indeed what many people end up doing, as opposed to just using it as a piece of information to help you make a decision. It has, why do so many colleges and grad schools teach p equals 0.05? That's what the scientific community and journal editors use. Why do they use it? That's what they were taught in college. So there's this cycle that is infinite and would never get broken out of, even though the statistics community recognizes it has some problems. This paper, straight up from the first sentence of that abstract, there is a crisis in the foundations of statistical inference. And later saying, what should or should not p-values be used for? Asking, why are they controversial? That is frequently misused, it is frequently misinterpreted, and that's where I have, in the misinterpretation, where I have said the p-value is the probability that the data supports the null hypothesis. Many people will confuse that with saying the p-value is the probability the null hypothesis is true. It does not do that. It is as much a statement of the data as it is of the hypothesis. And if the data is wrong, if the data has flaws, if the data is not a representative sample, for example, then even though you might say it does not support the null hypothesis, or it does support the null hypothesis, that does not guarantee the null hypothesis is true, or in the other direction, that it is false. And some have gone as far as to say statistical significance and the use of p-values ought to be put in a storage closet of discarded scientific ideas, ranging from ether to phlogiston to misinterpreting this as a cyclops skull, the four humors of blood, phlegm, bile, black bile, and yellow bile, and other assorted, thoroughly discredited phenomena or beliefs. The last thing I will bring up and this is about the presentation part, related to the coronavirus. We have seen, and possibly more than ever before, it used to be the case that we would see various charts and maps when there were election results. Now we have information and charts about the coronavirus and COVID-19. And I've brought up the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources site, where they're showing the progression, the number of new cases each day, and the total number of cases in the state. The gender breakdown, female versus male, which age group is hardest hit. We see 70 plus, probably not a surprise. A racial breakdown that I don't know the West Virginia totals off the top of my head, but for this, it probably matches the state's racial breakdown fairly well, although that is not necessarily true throughout, where I've heard in some places the African American population is hit more heavily. A map of cases, which I would argue they have not done too well with this, in that they are showing the number of cases, which for the most part, well, recognizing Kanawha County, that's Charleston. Of course, it has a lot of cases. Monongalia County, Morgantown, again, a larger city. Eastern Panhandle, especially Berkeley County, with the Berkeley and Jefferson having, in some ways, cities that are connected to Washington, D.C., people commuting, and they have larger populations. Where it's showing, with the exception of Jackson County and Wayne County, where there have been cases in nursing homes and so on, greatly increasing the number of cases in those counties. A lot of this is simply, there's more people living there, so of course there's more cases. If this were standardized to rates, like I've been using in the quizzes and as is used in the final lab, it would probably be more useful. So looking at the rollout of testing, the rollout of testing at long-term care facilities, as I mentioned, some places in, say, Wayne County, one here in Monongalia County, one in Jackson County, having a very large number of cases, greatly increasing the number of coronavirus cases in those particular communities. And we have more charts on the current status, and we see where most of the people who have been testing positive have been staying at home, with only a few going to the hospitals and even more stringent going to the intensive care units or requiring ventilators, as well as fatalities. And some charts comparing West Virginia against other neighboring states in terms of the fatality rate, the percent of people who are to have tested positive who then die, the percent of the population, that overall population which has tested positive, the percent of tests given which returned positive, as well as the percent of the population which has been tested. So we have throughout, and I'll go back to the county level information with the map, we have throughout a presentation of these statistics, not just to inform policymakers, but to inform the general public. And here we have a new way in which statistics and society interact. My personal belief or opinion is that this is by and large a good thing in giving information, releasing this so that anybody can use that information for scientific studies or for their own family's decision making. Even though there is a cost potential of people seeing this and misusing it, misinterpreting it, and giving, in a way, misleading information. I have seen, I do not have it pulled up here on the computer, but I've seen charts pointing out things like the number of cases in states that have Democratic governors have been higher than the number of cases in states with Republican governors. That may well be true by virtue of the fact that the states with the largest population, California, New York, Illinois, I believe, will tend to have Democratic governors right now. And so, yes, the states that have Democratic governors may indeed, on average, have more cases than the states with Republican governors. That is, first, by and large, irrelevant. The party affiliation of the governor is much less important in how they acted. As we can see through this state comparison, that it would appear that through having more of the population tested than any of our neighboring states and a lower percent of the test positive, that West Virginia, with the Republican Governor Jim Justice, has done pretty well. At the same time, the percent of population positive of our neighbors, the next lowest is Kentucky with a Democratic governor. Same with the percent of test positive. After that, we have Ohio with a Republican governor, followed by Virginia with a Democratic governor. So seeing this, there isn't necessarily any great, it's about Justice and Beshear in Kentucky and DeWine in Ohio all took action pretty quickly to impose social distancing and stay-at-home orders. That is what we are seeing. States that took longer to impose that may be faring worse. And large urban areas have an additional complication, like the New York metro area, of both having international airports where the virus could come in quickly and early. And by virtue of having a denser population, it's harder to implement social distancing when you have many people living in crowded apartment buildings, and they might find it literally quite challenging to get more than 6 feet away from their neighbors, especially as they go in and out of the buildings to go grocery shopping. And that should be recognized as a factor. So there's a whole lot more than political party, even though that is something that has been something that has been argued, even if erroneously. So we have these different ways in which the society and statistics interact, both in terms of or throughout with what the data that is collected, what data is shared, how it is analyzed, who gets to access that data. And here we have other examples of how the data is presented and what gets, how is it presented, what is made public, and in a way, working with a society that, for one reason or another, through perhaps technology, through phones, may be more, I guess, literate or may find it easier to understand graphical depictions and maps, as opposed two charts and tables like this. So many ways society and statistics interact. As I said at the outset, there will be questions on this on the exam. What I would do for that is to pose a question along the lines of whether or not you think, to take an example from the slides, whether or not you think the Landsat data should be free of cost. And why do you think that? You can argue, yes, it should be free of cost because the benefits of making it publicly available for scientific purposes, for commercial purposes, those benefits outweigh any costs that, any money that the government would recoup from the costs. On the other hand, you could argue that no, it should not be free. The government does have the right and obligation as good stewards of the taxpayer funding to recoup those costs and not have taxpayer money be spent where it doesn't have to be in a sense, a loss on the government's books. You could argue either way. For questions that I pose like this, you have to be able to think through and justify your answer and, in a sense, give reasons to convince me you are correct. Even if I do or do not agree with you, that will not affect whether you get points on any such questions. The other way there could be questions on this, on the final exam, would be through something like, say, a multiple choice question of what are some of the issues regarding privacy of data? And I would have 3 issues that are true and 1 that is false. And it would be identifying the false issue in that kind of context, in that kind of question. So as always, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, I encourage you to email me. I've gotten plenty of emails. I encourage you to, if you would rather use the discussion boards, there have been a much lower number of questions on those, but if you would rather use that, that is fine by me. And last would be a reminder, or a couple reminders. First would be if you want me to look over your results for the first lab, or not the first, the last lab, please send those to me by email, preferably. I have already gotten 1 set of results, and I noticed 1 person already uploaded a report into eCampus, which may have been an attempt to do that. I have not looked at it yet. But if you want to get the bonus points, please send me the results. Once you do, I will send you back comments on whether or not you chose the correct method, or if there were any other potential errors that you made. I will let you know, and you'll have the chance to redo that if there are any problems before you write up the report. So there's a benefit above and beyond simply the 10 bonus points you would get for getting that completed early. And the other reminder is that I would appreciate it if you filled out the SCIs for this course. Even in this weird COVID environment and the mid-semester switch to an online environment, I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the feedback in both the on-site or the on-campus portion. After all, who knows the extent to which we will be back on site versus online for the fall. If there are ideas on or feedback on either what did work or what did not work in the online environment, I appreciate that feedback just as much as feedback on the on-site portion. So I would appreciate you all to fill out the SCI forms. And since this is likely to be the last video of the course, functioning as the last class, I appreciate all of the hard work you have put in, both on-site and remotely. It has been a pleasure to have you in class. I appreciate all the work you have done, as I said, and I hope you have learned a few things throughout this semester. And whether that's the techniques, whether that's writing the reports, whether that is simply how to cope in an online environment. Um, and I just want to say thank you for being good students and for all the hard work you have put in this semester. And I hope everybody is staying safe, staying healthy. I know some of you have jobs that put you, whether through retail, through working within the healthcare system, that put you in the line of duty, so to speak, these days. And an extra set of thanks to you, as you have both done that work and pushed through and done the work for the course. Um, so hopefully, for at least those of you who are not graduating, maybe I will see you in the fall. I will see you on campus. If not, um, thanks again for what I hope is watching the videos, and have a good summer. And for those who are graduating, congratulations. So I guess this will be the last sign off, and best of luck and best wishes to everyone. Thanks again. Goodbye.